Hi, folks. Thanks for logging on to session 5 of the Food Systems Summit, hosted by Richmond Law Group and CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. I'm Jack with Richmond Law Group, and I'm going to make a few announcements before I begin. Our panel is going to begin in a couple minutes to give everyone enough time to log on and become familiar with the platform. I want to call your attention to the questions box, where you can post questions to the panelists and make comments. I'm going to be closely monitoring the chat, and Jay from Richmond Law Group is going to answer any of your questions. And at the end of the presentations, he's going to ask the panelists your questions. In the meantime, please use the question box to tell us who you are, your organization, your title, and your area of expertise. Feedback from a growing number of participants and results of various polls have shown us that attendees are interested in leaning in further on an array of food-related issues across various mediums of social media and otherwise. If you're interested in participating further, you can email information at richmondlawgroup.com to learn more. We have several different working groups, including ones on matters relating to farm-raised fish, to regenerative agriculture, roundtable discussions such as film screenings, public education around glyphosate, and public health crises due to factory farms. We also have growing coalitions organizing to ban glyphosate from parks and playgrounds and banning factory farms. With that, I'm going to ask that Kim from Richmond Law Group leads us off.
Kim, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Yes, common error in this day and age. And so I am happy that we can be here today again. And want to thank again everyone for tuning into our Food Systems Summit. And thank you to our co-hosts at the Urban Food Policy Institute at the City University of New York. We'll kick it off shortly with our esteemed moderator, Traci, and our panelists to discuss how we can support farmers now more than ever. So you don't have to go beyond the headlines these days to understand how dire our economic and food systems are in the face of this pandemic. Headlines from the New York Times with regards to unemployment being the worst since Depression. And as our colleague Zach Corrigan from Food and Water Watch keenly observed on our panel last week when discussing the Tysons and the Smithfields and the headlines, it is not just humans with comorbid issues that are being hit the hardest by the pandemic, but these large consolidated corporate meat entities with their own comorbid issues of how they mistreat their workers, and not to mention trimorbid environmental, animal welfare, and public health issues. We also just saw in the latest headlines by the cutting edge food journal, The Counter, the article co-authored by Dan Barber, which is up on your screen right here, where nearly a third of small independent farmers are facing bankruptcy by the end of 2020, new surveys say. The next slide and the following slides are just various quotes from the article, which I do urge you to check out, and of course subscribe to The Counter, which is really just a wonderful cutting edge journal on a whole host of food related issues. With Stone Barton Center for Food and Agriculture chef Dan Barber and his restaurant Blue Hill surveyed 240 farmers. The central finding: COVID-19 is a generational catastrophe, and without any intervention, many will not survive through next spring. And so if we can also turn to the next slide here, there will be a shift in direction, one way or the other. He's sure of it, even as he believes that revolution has a chance against regression, that a well-informed public can define a new food culture that supports diverse small farms and tells the big brands to back off. Dan Barber goes further, makes some pretty poignant points. It won't be easy. It requires a new definition of food processing, a cadre of foot soldiers willing to march into the fields to save the harvest. And an embrace of what Barbara sees as magnificent inefficiency, a retooled regional food network with more, not fewer businesses. Efficiency is overrated. As far as he's concerned, it's what got us to Cheetos in the first place. He goes further and observes that when it comes to the crossroads that we're at right now, this is a moment for standing up and digging in for what we want and not allowing big food to take the market back. And he states, and I'm pissed, we really need to take a stand. We're looking at a precious time for the farmers. We desperately need for our health, our happiness, the health of the environment. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Traci to share some introductory comments as well as introduce our first panelist, Danielle. So please take it away, Traci, and hopefully you're not on mute like myself.
All right. Well, I want to thank Kim and everyone with the Richmond Law Group for hosting this summit and exploring these important conversations. So I'm really happy to be here and be part of the discussion. My name is Traci Bruckner, and I'm the Policy Program Director with the Sustainable Agriculture and Food System Funders. To give you a bit of background about SAFSF, we are an affinity group of philanthropic grant makers and mission-based investors that have an interest in just and sustainable agriculture and food systems. Our membership consists of community and corporate foundations, private foundations, government agencies, health conversion funds, investment organizations, as well as individual donors and investors. So we have about 95 members who invest across the country, and we estimate that they'll invest about $194 million in 2020 to support sustainable ag and food systems. That number is actually lower than what we will see invested because some of our members are not able to disclose their funding amounts. And I would also add that in the face of the current COVID-19 issue, some of our members have really stepped up to the plate and are actually investing even more to support sustainable food systems. And just a bit of background on me and the personal interest that I bring to this issue stems really from where I sit. I'm kind of in the belly of the beast, you could say. I'm based in rural Nebraska, and before coming to SAFSF in October of 2018, I spent the better part of the last 2 decades working with farmers and rural communities on policy reforms at the federal and state level, designed to support a more just and sustainable ag and food system. My husband and I actually farmed too, and we experienced the not so favorable end of livestock consolidation towards fewer and larger producers. And policy work really requires meeting people where they are and working to understand the perspective of others, especially those with whom we do not agree all the time, to really find those areas of common ground and understanding and build the dialogue and relationships that ultimately leads us to the change we're all seeking. So I think that's directly related to the conversations we're having today. Fighting for change in our communities and legislative bodies at the federal, state, and local levels, it's really hard work, and we can't do it alone. It takes a lot of us. And these are not easy issues. It requires organizing to build a voice, as you'll hear from our speakers. It requires forming partnerships up and down the spectrum and being open to new ideas and sometimes uncomfortable conversations. So that's what you're going to hear from our panelists today. They're going to talk about the organizing work they're doing and the partnerships they're building to support their movements for change, including how they work to find common ground. In fact, during some of our planning discussions, we actually had some really good conversation about some areas where we were seeking common ground. So we practiced up for this conversation. So I would ask all the participants as you settle in to hear from our panelists today to ask you to think about how we can all work together to build solid organizing campaigns that involve new and lasting partnerships and relationships that really move us towards that long-term change we need for our communities and for the greater good. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to Danielle Diamond. Danielle is the Director of Field Operations with the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, otherwise known as SRAP. Danielle is an attorney, community organizer, and environmental policy advocate with more than a decade of experience confronting the critical threats posed by industrial livestock production. In addition to overseeing SRAP's national team of community organizers, Danielle serves as a research associate with the Department of Anthropology at Northern Illinois University and has published articles in the Journal of Rural Studies, Rural Sociology, and the Drake Journal of Agricultural Law. Danielle holds a Master's of Arts in Applied Environmental Anthropology from NIU and a Juris Doctorate from the NIU College of Law. So Danielle, let's kick it off with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to mirror Traci's thanks and gratitude to the Richmond Law Group for putting on such an impressive gathering of speakers throughout the summit and for inviting us to be a part of it. And as Traci said, I'm the Director of Field Operations at SRAP. I've worked with the organization for over a decade now and really have focused primarily on factory farm issues almost 100% of the time for that duration. I'll talk a little bit more about SRAP later, but one thing that I wanted to note just at the outset is I believe we are the only organization in the country that does have a complete focus on working with rural communities with factory farm problems. We do it nationwide, but we do it primarily at the local level. So that is, I think I'm ready for slide 2. Why do we focus on community impacts? I'm sure most of this audience is well aware that there is an extensive body of peer-reviewed research showing the adverse environmental impacts of CAFOs, including air, land, and water pollution, public health risks such as antibiotic resistance, antibiotic diseases similar to COVID that can actually have greater impacts beyond local surrounding communities. We might not know exactly how great these risks are, but we know enough to know that they should be avoided, particularly when other viable options exist. CAFOs cause social divisiveness and loss of social cohesion. Often you see farmers against farmers, neighbors against neighbors, and even sometimes family members against family members, and divided on whether or not a CAFO is good for their community. We see significant impacts to quality of life for people living near and around these facilities, loss of enjoyment of their property. Odors can sometimes be so bad that people can't spend time outside or open their windows. And these types of conditions lead to economic decline, particularly in property values for surrounding landowners, particularly with those that are in close proximity to CAFOs. We see economic extraction and decline and loss of tax revenue and whatnot. I have a quote from Dr. John Eichert, Professor Emeritus of Agricultural Economics from the University of Missouri that I like to refer to. And he said, not a single community where a CAFO, there's not a single community where a CAFO represents a significant segment of the local economy where it's looked upon today as a model of economic success and prosperity. It's actually the exact opposite. These facilities are often cited in economically deprived and environmental justice areas where people have less access to legal resources and political avenues to help protect themselves. And this often exacerbates the problems that we already see in rural areas that we're already facing, like poverty, unemployment, flight of local businesses, and the list goes on. Our organization focuses on these communities because they really are some of the most directly impacted by this industry, and in my belief, they are some of the most underserved communities in the country. But I would be remiss not to mention that the problem caused by CAFOs are obviously not confined to these rural areas. Continued research shows that factory farms are connected to widespread problems that impact all of us. They're hotspots for the prevalence of zoonotic diseases, viruses, antibiotic-resistant superbugs, and can lead to global problems, not dissimilar to what we're seeing with the coronavirus we're experiencing today. So that covers that slide. But when we know all these things are wrong, why does the industry continue to proliferate? And I think from our experience at SRAP, there are definitely evident legal and policy barriers that people confront in trying to address their impacts. In fact, from my perspective, our perspective as an organization, if CAFOs were actually held accountable for the pollution and the externalities that they impose on surrounding communities, it's highly likely that they wouldn't have the ability to survive in the marketplace. Also, the industry exists in large part in many rural areas by way of stripping away the rights of people and governmental entities to oppose them. So often local governments are preempted from regulating CAFOs in their jurisdictions, and even the standing of adjoining neighbors, landowners, potentially affected parties to challenge illegal siting decisions have been taken away in some states. So as many as you know, attempts by the federal government, federal EPA, to regulate CAFOs under the Clean Water Act have been eroded over time as a result of continual challenges by the industry. And often states have requirements that they should follow as well, but in many cases, those requirements can be voluntary or they're very vague, and it becomes difficult to enforce them. There's also a lack of transparency. We're constantly at battle with various governmental entities in trying to obtain information that citizens really have legal rights to. Privacy claims that have been made by the industry have made it difficult even for the federal and state governments to properly account for where these facilities are. And large agribusiness organizations limit identification and liability through the creation of complex business structures. What we see commonly are layering of limited liability corporations, so layering those corporations on top of one another, so it becomes very difficult for people to identify who the owners or the real investors are behind the scenes in these facilities. Every state in the nation has a right to farm law, and originally these laws were intended to protect agricultural areas against the encroachment of development on agricultural lands, but now they really serve as a shield from nuisance suits for CAFOs. And often those right to farm laws have unfair fee shifting provisions that put the risks on plaintiffs bringing those suits in having to pay the attorney fees, costs, and sometimes even lost profits by the CAFOs if they don't win. And oftentimes those fee shifting provisions are one-sided for the plaintiffs. So as I've mentioned before, rural people often don't have the resources to be able to take those kinds of risks. And I will mention again, CAFOs notoriously locate in economically or socially disadvantaged areas. In addition, often you'll have one-sided where there may be just a few surrounding farmers or landowners that are going to be directly affected the most. And they would have to go up against a huge agribusiness corporation that's standing behind perhaps a contract farmer to be able to protect themselves. And the costs can tend to be insurmountable. There's also not a lot of pro bono legal representation out there for these types of cases, and especially when they're not cases that might end up in large jury awards or whatnot. We see a huge political influence over our regulatory agencies and lawmakers, in my opinion, to the degree that the industry in many cases has essentially written the laws to regulate them for themselves. And they've done so under the guise and this imagery of the traditional family farm that we know of years past. So those are some of the legal and political barriers that people in rural areas confront. And now I want to move on and talk a little bit about how we try to address these problems at SRAP. We have a mission to educate the general public about the negative effects of CAFOs while working directly with the communities that are most impacted by them. We're very unique in that a majority of our staff are farmers and ranchers themselves with direct experience dealing with factory farms that have come into their own communities, or perhaps they were in the factory farm system and successfully got out. And so they've become very credible leading experts in their fields. Another way we do our work is that we never solicit work. We actually have to have people request help from us, and we call these help requests SOSs. And one of the criteria, we usually don't turn down a community SOS. We do have criteria that we look at in terms of how much we invest our resources in trying to help them, but the primary criteria that we look at is whether or not that community is willing to organize. We provide a lot of different, I guess, services to these communities when they request our help, and we'll tailor our assistance to the community specific to those individual community needs, which could include anything from public educational outreach and community organizing support, media, social media support. We help them network with other experts and like-minded organizations, or even possible legal resources that might be able to come in and help in their cases. We try to create connections between the communities where we're working with larger state and national movements to help amplify those local voices. And we do a lot of assisting communities in navigating very complex regulatory frameworks where you have layers of state and federal laws, local laws that are intersecting. We develop a lot of self-help resources, and I'll get into some of those in a little bit, but the list goes on, but it's very specifically tailored to what the community needs are for that specific situation. And ultimately, our vision is that we want to replace the industrial livestock production model with an ecologically sound, economically viable, and socially responsible animal agriculture system. To this end, we do want to offer up solutions to that factory farm model. We have several projects going on, but one that I think is important to mention in this context is we're starting up a pilot project called the Socially Responsible Food and Farm Network, which will ultimately build a national network of farmers and rural residents who are living in impacted communities. And we will ultimately build this network of farmers and like-minded organizations and people from communities that are being directly impacted, because we believe that farmers are our best allies and they're our strongest voices in this movement. They are the most trusted spokespeople. And we want them to organize and educate and advocate for the healthy rural communities and responsible agriculture that we seek. And so our intent behind this project is to bring those farmers together to try to amplify their voices and to build power, and also connect them with other resources and organizing support. Another program that we have, which ties back to some of the self-help resources that we have what we call our Water Rangers program, which provides guidance and training to community partners, local community partners who are interested in monitoring and documenting reporting water pollution events from CAFOs. That's been a super successful program. And so that has been something that's been ongoing for quite some time. And then another example of one of the programs we have is our state-by-state CAFO regulatory guides. We have developed regulatory guides for just about every state in the nation, particularly those that are heavily impacted by CAFOs, to help outline and explain the complicated framework that each state has in regulating these facilities. And we've created these because oftentimes when we receive help requests, the people are under time constraints, and it's very difficult for them to navigate all of this on short notice. And so we have these guides that are actually very valuable in-house resources that we use, but also we give to the communities that we work with so they know what steps they need to take and how, and where the intersections are between state, local, and federal law. And we also offer these resources up to other like-minded organizations that are working on these issues, and even sometimes legal counsel that might be brought into a case that really needs to come up to speed on getting an understanding of what the regulatory framework is in that state in short order when they're representing a community represented by a community confronting a CAFO. So,
all right, Danielle, I want to pause here for a moment, and I'd like to move on to Leah, and if that's okay, just because want to leave plenty of time for questions from the participants. Is there one last point you'd like to make before we move on to Leah?
Yes, I was just going to say, I was going to conclude that because of all the barriers that we see with the agribusiness industry, our wins tend to feel few and far between. And people often ask, how do you stay motivated? How do you stay optimistic in what seems like a losing battle? And my answer to that question is, how can we not? And not long ago, one of my wise colleagues from SRAP said, reminding me of how almost overnight the Berlin Wall came down. And it seemed like almost overnight, but there was a social sort of change, social movement behind it that took place over time. And I think we're seeing something like that similar today. And so I think now, especially with the coronavirus, people really are coming to understand what it is like to live near a CAFO and what their risks are. And I think it's absurd that we've allowed them to engage in these practices and for so long when we know what the risks are. And I just hope that with this collective understanding that we've all developed now, it'll hopefully bring us one step closer to toppling over a flawed system that benefits the few at the expense of many. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Danielle. We'll come back for questions with Danielle after we get through Leah's presentation. So I want to introduce Leah. Leah Garces with Mercy for Animals. Leah is the president of Mercy for Animals and the author of Grilled, Turning Adversaries into Allies to Change the Chicken Industry, published by Bloomsbury in September of 2019. She has nearly 20 years of leadership experience in the animal protection movement and is partner of some of the world's largest food companies on her mission to end factory farming. So welcome, Leah, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Traci. And I loved your introduction about finding common ground. And that's really the subject of my book. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got there today. And Danielle, thank you too for your work. And I'll be speaking about someone who works with Danielle directly as well. So we're all connected, and I'm looking forward to hearing about Ben, who I met for the first time today. So this is a great panel. Thank you to the Richmond Law Group who has organized this. I hope you all enjoy it. Well, let me start, if you don't know me, a little bit about my personal worldview. I've always been a very strong proponent for being a constructive force in the world and not a destructive one. This means a lot of my work is often about looking for solutions and starting at points of agreement, which Traci was referring to, rather than starting at absolute perfection or just going straight to where we don't agree. And this has gotten me into plenty of trouble, I can tell you, especially for the purists in the world who it's tough. It's a tough world when you have values and morals, and I do. And I struggle with it sometimes too. But I stand by this approach that we can't let perfect be the enemy of better. I spent more than 20 years now advocating against all kinds of animal cruelty. And I transitioned to only focus on farmed animals a little over a decade ago. By the age of 30, I had been to 30 countries. I had visited lots of countries and seen every way, shape, and form that human beings cause suffering to animals. And this was through my work at World Animal Protection, which was then called World Society for the Protection of Animals. I was the director of campaigns. And one of them stood out as the one causing the most suffering, which is the next slide, which guess what it's going to be a picture of. I'll let you think about that for a second. Ta-da, the big reveal, farmed animals. Yeah. Farmed animals, there's 80 billion of them that are raised and slaughtered every year. More than 90% of them are in factory farms in this country. Very small fraction are done in more of the regenerative and organic kind of practices. The other part of me that really wanted to work on this, I wanted to work on it because it's a tractable problem. That means that it is a solvable problem. It's a problem that human beings can or cannot be involved in every meal. And this attracted me to solving the problem. And I also saw that big institutions were involved, like governments and supermarkets and retailers and restaurants, and it felt like this was a solvable problem. So I moved from London to Georgia about 10 years ago, where I had been living in London, as I said, working in international animal protection. And things were going along fine, where I thought I understood the problems very well, and I thought I understood the enemies. And the enemy clearly is a factory farmer, because obviously they are evil people who are hurting animals and doing terrible things to them, right? So I thought, as an animal rights activist, until I met this man. Next slide, please. Who I believe might be on the call and works with Danielle. So, big reveal. This is Craig Watts. So Craig Watts, as you can see, and I are standing in his very large chicken factory farm, which had, I think, about 25, 30,000 chickens in them. And he was raising chickens for Purdue. And as it goes, until meeting Craig, I really thought that Craig was the enemy. And up until that point, he represented everything that I hated. You know, I really thought he embodied everything that was wrong with the system, until I had the opportunity through a journalist to sit down and talk to him. And I had been trying to get a site of a factory farm like this at a time when it was, and still is, impossible to get footage, to get in, to openly say, hey, where is the majority of this protein that people eat coming from? You can't do that. You cannot just walk into a factory farm. But Craig, maybe because he was curious as I was about him, or he's crazy, but he's on the line, so I can say that. He's a little of both, by the way, and so am I. He invited me, and we decided to team up. And we were both livid about how chicken was being portrayed. At the time, Purdue had a label that said humanely raised, and we knew, and we were from very different walks of life here, we knew that that was not right. And as I sat and I got to know Craig, I really began to understand Craig's hardships too, and how unfairly he was being treated, how he was essentially an indentured servant. And just briefly to explain what that means is, Craig, when he was in his early 20s, he had dreamed of this way to stay on the land that had been passed down 5 generations, and tobacco had fallen out in North Carolina, and chicken industry rolls into town and offers a contract. So he takes out $250,000 loan, and then he raises chickens, and with each flock he pays off that debt like a mortgage. And seems fine at first, but of course chickens start to get sick, because look at the conditions, and no matter how good of a manager or farmer you are, you cannot fight the fact that this is an unhealthy system. And you don't get paid for dead chickens, and pretty soon Craig realized he'd made a mistake, but he was trapped. And this is, you know, I met him 20 years into this feeling trapped situation. We decided to work together. We did a short film. It was 5 minutes, and it resulted in a big explosion. So the next slide, please. It resulted in Nicholas Kristof covering it in the New York Times back in 2014, and the video went viral. We had 1 million views in 24 hours. And eventually, surprisingly, it led me to sit down with, as I sat there and I worked with Craig, I really had this understanding of, okay, I put myself in this uncomfortable situation. I dared to work with an unlikely ally. Who else is out there that I can talk to? And again, I went into this controversial space where I actually sat down with Jim Purdue himself and began talking. And this was the man who was literally the villain in the video, in our viral video. And, you know, to their credit, they have made some positive changes. Like they put windows in the houses, which was one of the things, natural light, that we'd criticize them for not doing. And that you can see in the next slide, some of the media coverage has started to come out about that about 2 years later. And they came out with the first animal care policy that of any major chicken company. And I've gone on to do a lot of that work, and it's sometimes really hard and it's sometimes really controversial, and I get a lot of criticism for it. But I think that we have to focus on progress. And for me, there's no point in just talking to people who agree with you. We won't make progress that way. And we have to push ourselves into uncomfortable situations and be willing to, I believe the way forward is by not beating down our enemy, but by getting everyone on the path, no matter where they need to start, no matter how far back in the path they need to start. And that's the constructive side of where we look for mutual benefits. Looking at Mercy for Animals, next slide, where I am now the president. I became the president in October in 18. They share my mission. We created a new mission when I started, and that mission is to construct a compassionate food system by reducing the suffering of animals trapped in the system while ending the exploitation of animals altogether. So what does that look like in practice? And I'm just going to give you, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to just quickly tell you a couple of ways we're manifesting that mandate. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to keep talking about Craig, because he's here. This is not Craig. This is actually a friend of Craig's and a friend of mine named Mike Weaver. He's in West Virginia. And he has, these are, you guessed it, not marijuana, hemp. That's hemp, everybody. And it turns out the warehouses that you grow chickens in are really good at growing other things like hemp, like mushrooms. And we created Mercy for Animals in November, launched a project called Transformation. And this is where the constructive side comes in. So we're not just here to say end factory farming. We're saying we're going to actually carve out solutions. We're going to show how it could be done and enable and facilitate the actually constructive side of that. So we're working with a handful of farmers to change their warehouses into an alternative income, because the main reason people are getting into this in the first place, as Danielle was pointing out, is because there's no other economic opportunities quite often. And so we're trying to passionately think about what could the solutions be. And this is one, Mike Weaver did this on his own, and it just showed us the potential. And he is making more money, he's using less water, he's employing more people. We are currently just in the beginning stages, which I'm so excited about, considering the journey of working with Craig too on moving to mushrooms. And so just watch that space. And we're crunching numbers, and my team and him are working with an engineer. We're working with a mycologist to look at all of that. But transformation is a really positive step of a manifestation of that mandate. The next one is very current to what we're doing. We do a lot of policy work, first to support transition farms. So for example, we're supporting, you might have seen that Warren endorsed Booker's new Farm Reform Act, which specifically calls for ending CAFOs by 2040. And there's definitions of that. It's not perfect, but it's great. It's a great step. And I would love to live in a world where that was a law. And part of that is also debt relief for these farmers. So farmers being able to get out of their debt and to be a buyout system. We've been working with Booker's office. We also are working on advocating for COVID-19 relief money to go to improving, diversifying, and transitioning farms. And we're actively advocating that money should not go to prop up big ag and a failing system. So if you are so inclined, the HEROES Act, which is live right now, and it's going to be voted upon by the Senate. It passed the House. It includes aspects, for example, that repay the industry for the massive killing of animals on farms because they can't go to slaughterhouses. And we don't think that should be something that taxpayers pay for. It's an indication of a failing system, and we shouldn't keep plugging holes in a very holy bucket, and holy not in the good way, holy in the bad way. So next slide. We're also doing a lot to promote and support the growth of the plant-based economy as a viable and sustainable source of protein. This was very exciting in my own hometown in Atlanta. We had KFC do plant-based chicken nuggets from Beyond, and I went to the sample day, and it was kind of crazy because it looked like there was lines wrapped around the corner and the traffic was stopped and there's police directing, and this was over beyond chicken nuggets, and they painted the whole thing lime green. It was very exciting and very surreal. So these are 3 examples of how we're trying to be constructive forces in the world and carve out solutions. And yeah, next slide. I'm excited to be on this panel and hear what folks are thinking about of our food system and its direction. And thank you so much to Richmond Law Group for inviting me and giving a platform for this entire conversation. You all are great.
Sure thing, Leah. Thank you so much for your comments. And Traci, I'm not sure if you have any follow-up questions or comments before we pivot further.
No, I think we better pivot to Ben, and then we'll let the participants ask questions. How's that sound?
Wonderful, excellent. And yes, thanks again, Leah and Danielle. And in terms of talking about this arc, right, from the destructive to the constructive to now the regenerative, which is where we're going to turn the conversation right now to Ben Dobson, who is with Stonehouse Farms and is a regenerative farmer and is really, frankly, rebuilding the system from the soil up, and has been doing some very exciting things in upstate New York with his farm and his partners. And I'm going to turn it over without further ado to Ben. So thank you, Ben, for joining us today as our quote unquote farmer in residence.
You're on mute, Ben.
Thank you, Kim, and to everyone else on the panel. I really appreciated hearing you, Traci, Danielle, and Leah. My name's Ben Dobson. I was born on small organic farms. My parents did the rebelling, so I just had to do the building. And I am in my home county. I'm in Columbia County, New York, and
We're having a little bandwidth issues there with you, Ben, and I just have to call out the connection here with some of my earlier comments from Stone Barns and Dan Barber to Stonehouse Farms. And there is indeed a connection between the 2 farms. And they, in fact, receive support from the Rockefeller family, who has been really a huge thought leader in the agricultural space. And if we haven't already made the connection, you know, each of the panelists have talked about, frankly, different models, economic and otherwise, in supporting small farmers and rural communities, as well as you know, transitioning folks from conventional to regenerative, as we heard from Leah, which is really quite exciting. And I believe Ben on his farm has now got some great bandwidth back for the time being.
can you hear me now? Okay, I'm very sorry. So I manage Stonehouse Farm, and I was hired 7 years ago to transition a 2,000-acre farm producing GMO corn and soy and some stocked feeders to an organic diversified system. And we live in an area that's 2 hours from New York, and we have hundreds of small farms that have been popping up. They mostly sell vegetables, meat, and eggs directly that they raise directly to consumers at, and I don't like to say consumers, I like to say eaters, directly to eaters at farmers markets through CSAs and restaurants. We spent the first year listening, and I'd like to go to the next slide. We spent our first year listening to the community, and everyone said, well, you're a grain farm, but we need organic grain and non-GMO grain for our bakeries, for our breweries, for our small-scale livestock farms. And I've spent my whole life organic farming, but what I really realized is instead of being the farmer who would
Hey, Ben, maybe turn off your video to allow for your audio to come through if you're having bandwidth issues.
Which is, I know, par for the course these days, as everyone's fighting for bandwidth, both technical and otherwise. And nevertheless, we've been able to, yes, I think work out the technical difficulties here. And feel free to chime back in, Ben. And
is this working better? I turned off my video.
Perfect. We can hear you perfectly, Ben. And we can perhaps even nonetheless go through the slides with the assistance of Jack.
farm, we converted from a no-till with some tillage GMO system that used Monsanto seeds, growing corn and soybean. And our initial premises were to provide key inputs to the local food system so that our local food system could be more sustainable, and also to change the
Yeah, once again, it's a challenge, right? When working from a small farm, and I will give Ben just another moment to hopefully zoom back in, or perhaps call in to the line, and we'll of course get him a number to reach us at with the assistance of with Jack. And so in a moment, we're going to turn to the next slide. You'll see some of the beautiful pictures from the farm, and Ben has in fact been a very outspoken advocate on regenerative farming. Perhaps have seen him on his TED Talk from a couple of years ago, and urge folks to check him out. I also am very impressed with how they're going beyond, and not only being a model of converting conventional dairy farmland to these beautiful photos you see here, but also is pushing the envelope further, and has a number of projects underway with regards to offsetting carbon. And as we talked about at the top of the hour, we have gotten a great response and call for action, and have indeed been forming everything from working groups to roundtable discussions to coalitions. And we indeed foresee Ben being very instrumental in those discussions, and can in fact share with folks who are interested in really embracing a new model, regenerative model, going forward. This is also an interesting turning point in the Food System Summit, wherein we have in fact talked extensively about the problems around our crumbling food systems, and how perhaps with the assistance of the environmental movement, the animal rights movement, the labor movement, we can resurrect a healthy, more regenerative, more sustainable food system well into the future. And in the next panel, we will indeed hear from some other leading advocates, and we'll talk about various policy solutions and legislative efforts that are underway in conjunction with all the other efforts, legal or otherwise, that we've heard over the course of this food summit, from the Green New Deal to international efforts. We would also hear from a local councilman who's going to be talking about efforts on the ground in New York City, as well as some state efforts which are underway. And so it really is this local, state, national, international effort that really needs to coalesce. And while the tech has proved to be a little tricky, it has nonetheless afforded us to pull together in ways like never before. And clearly with the pandemic, there has been a renewed call to action, and I think we are at this unique place in history. Jack, are we able to be joined once again? Yes, we can. Go ahead, fire away.
Okay. So at Stonehouse Farm, our focus has been directly facing the problems of this system. And we've been able, over the last 5 years, to build a local grain supply chain in which we have changed our practices to organic regenerative ones that sequester carbon, store water in the soil, and very much limit any nitrogen pollution. While replacing, we make 3,000 tons of local grain, about 1,000 tons of which go directly to local bakeries, breweries, and others. And the other 2,000 tons we make non-GMO and organic animal feeds that we sell directly to small producers who all raise on pasture, and then that food is sold directly to people. Right now, with COVID hitting, our business is growing very, very rapidly, and we've built a supply chain of local farms. So we have about 1,000 acres of off-farm production supporting us, and these farms have transitioned as well. And we really work to emulate an entire food system in how our farm works as well. For our nutrient, we need animals, and we need animals that rotate properly. So we use planned grazing and grass-fed cattle to rotate around the farm, and then we use their manure to make compost, that we make compost teas with and we spread on the land to rotate to make our human grade grains. So nature had always had animals and plants. And although we have fences, we don't have CAFOs. The animals live on the land. And we've been able to use cattle to leverage their nutrient, and then we make grain that then goes directly to local producers. And we do all of our business within 60 miles of the farm. And then about 90% of the money we bring in stays within 40 miles of the farm. And then some of it goes, like for tractor payments, that goes to Case IH. They're pretty far. But we feel that in our model, we estimate that around 20,000 humans get their protein as a result of the customers we sell to. And those customers are small independent farmers who sell their food directly. So we feel that we've been working on this model forever, and not forever, but for 5 years. And now we're at a crossroads where it's more important than ever. And we think this model can become replicable. Our farm is profitable. And we have a carbon project. We work closely with scientists, and we've calculated and verified 28,000 tons of carbon we've sequestered over the last 5 years. And we'll be offering those credits for sale over the second half of this year. So we feel that when farming is done properly, you can convert from a conventional system. This farm used to sell grains that would support CAFOs. And you can convert to a farm in which you sell grain directly to people who feed animals at the right scale and treat those animals properly. And you can also sell grain directly to people who eat the grain in bread or drink it in beer or otherwise. We also now grow sunflowers on the farm in order to make sunflower oil for cooking. And the sunflower meal goes into soy-free animal feeds. And we grow field peas, we grow buckwheat that sells for pancakes. And we've been really working on eliminating soy production from our farm due to a lot of the potential health defects of soy. And we focus on alternative pulse crops such as sunflowers, buckwheat, peas. And in doing so, we've found that we've controlled weeds more, made our soils healthier, and we're seeing changes in some of the protein and nutrient contents in our small grains for human consumption. These are just a few pictures of cattle. You see in the bottom right, we're now incorporating a grass-fed, 100% grass-fed Guernsey organic dairy herd into the farm. So these cows will only be in the barn for milking, or if they want to be, otherwise be grazing in a rotation. And their manure, along with other local inputs, we're building a much larger composting operation with on the farm to continue building our soil. And we feel that animals are a critical part of a system, but it's really about how they are treated. And I think our model shows that a decentralized farming model can work. And I think that that's what's essential. At 2,000 acres, we are large for our region. For regions such as Iowa and Nebraska, we'd be small or medium-sized. But we really feel that now is the time to move and show this model to other regions and people elsewhere around the world. The slide that we're on now, this next slide shows our rotation, where we first grow a 2 or 3 year perennial seed down, where in hay or pasture. And these perennials flood out weeds, build soil carbon, build nitrogen in the soil, and then we rotate into a corn crop. And then from there, we go to oil seeds or pulse crops, such as sunflowers, buckwheat, and peas. And then we rotate to small grains, which are mostly human grade grains. And then at the same time those are in the ground, we seed back down to perennials. And this rotation not only makes the land healthier, but it represents a much more diversified and healthy diet for humans. And we feel that in this model, a model in which farmers only grow mostly corn and soy across the country, and then that corn and soy is fed to CAFOs, and we end up with very unhealthy and unhappy animals, and then unhealthy and unhappy people. All of that links back to the soil itself. When you farm in a rotation that builds the soil and the soil's health, you end up with a more diverse yield of crops that result in a more diverse diet for humans. A part of our efforts are now expanding into medicinal herbs such as CBD hemp, but this year echinacea, lavender, and nettles. And here on this next slide is a picture of what a lot of our crops look like. And this closing slide is one of our hemp. So we're really now moving forwards beyond a local food system, which we're a strong part of, but how do we also grow localized, regionalized medicine? And we're at the point now where now that we're profitable, we feel this is a model we can really share with other farms. And it's critical that we begin to decentralize our farm system. We need a network of smaller producers raising animals and vegetables and foods but where they need to work with larger producers is how we need our input supplies not to be global or national, but regional. So farms like ourselves who grow key inputs for local bakeries and farms can do so on large acreage in a very regenerative manner. And beyond that, we feel that marketing the ultimate ecosystem services, which is sequestered carbon, cleaner water, and no sound, no noise or smell pollution, is a key way. With the property values around our farm are actually higher and rising. We have had people selling property next to us for higher prices that have been selling. So I think that there's an absolute anecdote to the model, the sort of hellish model that has come to dominate. And I'm hoping we can continue to move forwards, and we're in the process of talking to some other farms in other regions about how to emulate this. I'd like to thank you all. I'm very sorry for the tech problems. And I'd like to thank you all for hanging in there and for getting the opportunity to speak.
Awesome, Ben. Great stuff. Excellent. And appreciate the evolving story that you've been sharing with us today. I'm going to turn it now over to Jay from my organization to share with the group some of the questions that people have been asking throughout this presentation.
Thanks, Kim. So the first question that we have here is from Alexis Baden-Mayer from the Organic Consumers Association. And Alexis asks, well, she says, thanks so much for mentioning the big meat bailout in the HEROES Act. It would allow the USDA to pay companies to kill surplus animals and keep their slaughterhouses running, even as workers and food safety inspectors continue to get sick. Is there a coalition working on this? How do we plug in? Leah, Danielle, and Ben, if you could get Congress to direct the trillions they're pumping into the economy right now on something other than propping up the failed factory farm system, what would it be?
Well, I'm happy to say, well, my email is leahg@mercyforanimals.org, and we are working with a coalition, and I can connect you to our government advisory team who can help get you on board. We need all the help we can get. It's a big lift. We also have a petition, so check out mercyforanimals.org, and you can find a way just to contact your own senator or get your membership to just sign up. And contact centers it's a short run on this. I don't honestly have a lot of faith, but we shouldn't stand by. We have to stand up against it, even if we don't win this time. I think if we just say nothing, that's worse. And we're working really hard. There's a chance, right? So, and there's going to be more bailouts and more ways in which the industry will be propped up. I'll let others answer the second question.
Now, this is Ben Dobson, and I feel that one of the top things we have to explain to the government is that the big problem has been created is that they've been taking taxpayer money to support the wrong model. And if in fact they would just stop the funding, and before even rethinking of how to fund small farm efforts, it'll cause a natural demand for the right type of products. There is in the next step, of course, we need funding for the expansion of the right system. But I think our country is based on overproduction of cheap, unhealthy food. And I think it's key that we start out by saying enough is enough, and we're not going to subsidize overproduction anymore. And the next thing to do is, instead of spending our tax money, they should be imposing quotas on the production of milk, corn, conventional soybeans, and conventional milk. This would allow farmers to make a living at a smaller scale, and it would allow us to save money. I think there are many next steps, but I think those are good first steps.
Danielle, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in. Do you have anything you want to share about how the government might be allocating money in a better way right now? Maybe on mute.
Traci, feel free to chime in if you want to also address this question.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, Danielle, you're unmuted now. Okay, go for
Why
it.
don't you go ahead, and then
Okay.
I'll.
I think I was on a call earlier today, actually, and one of the things that I heard was how much of this is really being driven by USDA, and regardless of what Congress would happen to do, they're not having a whole lot of influence over what USDA is doing with these funds. So it sounds like Congress is just sending letter after letter after letter to USDA, and not necessarily about not directing it in the fashion that the person who asked the question is concerned about. But I do think too, though, that this opportunity under what's happening with COVID, and I hate to talk about it as an opportunity, but we have to take every crisis and turn that into an opportunity. And I think this gives us the opportunity to really build a bigger, broader audience for this issue, and to possibly have some different discussions. And I'm waiting to see what happens in November as well. So, maybe there will be some, not to be partisan, but just, elections have consequences, and maybe those consequences will be more towards some areas to make positive change.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly mention, I mentioned in my talk, farmers really, we feel like farmers are the most powerful voices in these movements. And we have a new executive director, Sherry Duggar, who is actually initiating a letter writing campaign that will help farmers put together letters that they could send to their elected lawmakers. And I think she's doing it in collaboration with several organizations. It may even be Alexis from Organic Consumers Association. And so we're already trying to sort of harness this farmer network power to try to get those voices out there to help push for what we think is right. And that I think will be going on next week. So if anyone's interested in that, you can visit our website or email us and we'll get the information to you.
Thanks for that. And now I have a question for Leah that is actually, very relevant to my own experience and work. And that is, this is from Julia, saying that all of the producers I've been in contact with have prejudices against animal protection organizations and refuse to even meet with us. How did you approach producers who are not particularly collaborative?
Producers or the farmers? Is it producers? Are they asking about farmers in the beginning?
But I think it would be helpful to weigh in on all of the above.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is my life. It's trying to navigate this difficult pathway. And you're right. We, as animal rights activists, are often just dismissed and seen as just wanting to come into rural areas and take away jobs and take away choices. And that's the perception. And I think part of it is on us as animal rights advocates to flip that narrative to be constructive, which is why Mercy for Animals launched Transformation, because we want to be seen as a constructive force solving problems in rural communities where there's few economic choices, where a lot of the farmers I talk to don't actually want to be doing the job of a chicken factory farmer, which is not a nice job. Nobody wakes up and goes, that's what I want to do with my life. It's a very hard life where you're bending over and you're, every day having to find dead and dying chickens. It's not a great life. And so I think in terms of that, there's part of it's the onus is on us as animal rights advocates to come across as open, willing to hear, and constructive. With each of the people that I've approached that are so-called enemies, it's a very slow process of being open and listening and learning, coming to the table, and being kind of relentless. And I think sometimes it's if you're not getting, if the door is really firmly shut, just move to the next door. Move to the door that might be a little bit ready for a push, and keep going until you find the door that's a little easier. And don't keep pushing against the door that's firmly shut, because when you open the other doors, it might budge that closed door a little bit. So I'd say don't get stuck on someone who's saying no, no, no. Move on until you find someone who's at least curious and you can sit down at the table. And that's what happened with Craig Watts. It was years of me trying to get in a factory farm and years of me trying to talk to producers. And it was through finding the slightly ajar door that I was able to make some progress.
Thank you, Leah. And I'm going to wrap up the panel for today. I'm mindful of everyone's time, especially in this day and age. I appreciate everyone nonetheless taking this time to really delve into the issues. Leah, Danielle, Traci, Ben, great stuff. The conversations are continuing, as we've heard from the questions and answers today. Everything, from workshops to coalitions to roundtable discussions are all happening. And so we will indeed do everything in our power to support those efforts. And once again, stay safe, stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.